Tecal. Tecal was an empire that ruled the oceans for generations. Their ships, adorned with proud phoenix figureheads, smashed the waves as they voyaged from their hidden kingdom to every corner of our world. They brought silks, slaves, treasures, and automata to every nation they touched, leaving behind stories of their extravagant power and ruthlessness. Their ships were found in every port along the coast, from the ice fields to the inner sea, plying trade or demanding tribute, to be given as either wealth or victims, until they disappeared. It happened suddenly, and the world forgets quickly. It forgot about the red ships, about those imperious birds with wings unfurled. The power of Tecal and anyone who went looking for their lost kingdom were simply never heard of again. We were left with mere trinkets and wrecks of ships that washed ashore without their crew. On a few of those wrecks, all that was left of their masters was a mangled corpse. However, there was a moment right when it happened, in which every scholar wondered, theorized, speculated, and wrote about what may have been the fate of Tecal. They wrote fantasies of transcendence, of righteous destruction, of rampant disease, and each one claimed to be the final truth. They seized on whatever crumbs, rumor, or clever turn of logic they could find. I have read them all, and some of them came close. But the scale and span of what happened to that empire was much more than any of them could grasp. I, and I alone, have pieced together the truth. Tecal still stands. Like the hollowed trunk of an ancient oak, no howling winter or summer storm could topple. Their glorious capital is still here, inert and proud. I know this because I'm riding in the shadow of one of their palaces, ruined by the disaster that shattered their domain. It's a magnificent corpse, brimming with the justified arrogance of its creators, with columns of molten marble and frozen fire. The head of a statue of a judging deity is watching me with displeasure, and its beauty brings me dread and ecstasy. I wish for no other fate than to die in its shadow, so it may watch over my bones for all eternity. I paid a steep price to be able to write this, here amongst the ashes. I sank the ship that brought me here. I led the handful of its crew that survived to their deaths, tempting them with the promise of riches they would never be able to spend had they lived to find them. I don't feel pity for any of them. When we sailed past the maw, where the ships from every age were hoisted high from the waves, impaled on obsidian fangs, they knew. They saw the corpses. They saw the cruelty of Tecal from the moment that I used the lantern to open the path. The light of its gem of crystallized blood laid bare the truth. They should have known that I couldn't, that I wouldn't keep them safe. And yet they followed me, sure that fortune would be kind to them after they had come so far. Tecal doesn't tarnish itself with such vulgar mercies. They were vultures, eager to feast on the offal of an empire. They deserve less than the fate they met. Despite that, I am forced to be grateful to them. They brought me here and paid the toll that was asked so that I could learn the truth of this place. What I learned in exchange for that sacrifice is that the Tecalese did this to themselves. Their power, unleashed by their desire for more, devoured them. But not all the Tecalese nobles died seeking ascension into godhood. When the volcano they had enslaved to their will broke free and erupted, when the lava washed over their city, some of them were out in their villas and estates. These powerful alchemists and students of the arcane died menial deaths. But even then, they did so with grandeur. 2 days after the ship sank, I led a group of 5 survivors with the pretext of finding some way off this island. I knew that they were still thinking they may yet find a bauble, some jewel they could rip out of a dead hand. As for me, I was searching for a hint of Tecal's power, something that would prove that I was right, something that I could use to finally vindicate myself and bring the world that had mocked me to heel. Such was my impudence. We found a road after crossing a mile of rough ground through a tangle of colossal trees. That forest is a hunting ground of man-eating beasts of all kinds. The jungle here is insidious. It reclaims almost as much as we would be able to clear in one single day with tools and determination. The soil is too fertile to endure our attempts to tame it for even a day. And yet the paved stones the Tecalis laid down for the road we found are still immaculate, shaped with such force and ingenuity that they may outlast history itself. They scarred this land in a way that still will endure, even in a place where nature is this relentless. Though sunset was near, we decided to follow it deeper, trying to find a place where we could set camp, where we wouldn't be devoured in our sleep. In the twilight hour, we came upon a clearing that shouldn't have been there. The stubborn trees inexplicably surrendered their ground. The road ran through it, and on the road itself there were charred remains of something that may have been a wagon or chariot. Whatever it was, it burned with such intensity that the stones meant to endure the rise and fall of kingdoms were branded by their flames. I was intrigued, but the thought of something made by the masters of this place, something that could do all of this, gave me pause. Surely some echo would remain, and I didn't know what it could yet do to a mortal soul like mine. The sailors must have felt a similar kind of apprehension, an instinctive fear that even such low-born rabble would heed in the face of their insatiable greed. They hesitated at the edge of the clearing beside me, waving their torches at the shadows on either side as though that would dispel their fear. What they accomplished was to ignite each other's desire once more, as something in the charred remains glinted in the wavering light. "There's gold in that pile of ash," the one with the scar along his face said, gesturing with his torch. He was the most conniving out of all of them. He was smirking, looking to his fellows, goading them on. "Who's going to be the first here to get rich, eh? How about you, Mr. Feeney? Weren't you looking for a fancy bauble to prove this place was real?" I laughed off his provocation. "Gold can come from anywhere, my good man. I'll have my maps and my word as proof. Besides, someone might think I meant to take all the spoils for myself if I were to take the first thing we find. Someone else can have this one, just so we can all stay friends." The scarred sailor grinned. "Ah, one of us poor enlisted men gets a chance to make their fortune right here and now, then. Come on, you lot. No need to be shy. Your fate is calling." The rest of the sailors gave each other uneasy glances. In their animal cunning, they knew not to take this place lightly. Then the broad-shouldered one lost his patience and stepped up, scowling at his comrades before giving the instigator a steady glare. "If this turns out to be like that night in Cartesh, you're going to pay," the bold one told the conniver, and marched into the clearing. The scar on the other sailor's face twisted as he grinned even wider than before. The rest of us watched as the bold sailor ambled along the road. He was some 20 paces out when a spark, a spidery knot of blue lightning, scrambled up his leg, rounded his shoulders, and raced back down the other side. The white blue glow was dazzling and loud. All of us held our breath. The jungle became that much darker when the light faded. We could see him stopping, looking down at himself with what little light the torches were able to give. "Oi, you all right?" called another sailor, one of the youngest, with a shade of laughter in his voice. "I'm not scared of the storm, Sylph. Seen plenty at sea. More than you ever will," the bold sailor growled at the younger man, and, after looking down at his hands one more time, began to march again. A few strides closer, and another spark leapt up from the bare soil, almost identical to the first, coursing over the sailor just as before. This time, the bold sailor ignored it entirely. The lad must have taken that as some sort of cue. He ran into the clearing, feet slapping the flagstones loudly. The bold sailor barely had time to look back before he was overtaken by the younger man, who deftly ducked past him. The bigger man cursed and took off running after the lad, who was bathed in the same blue flashes while he ran. The rest of the crew relaxed, laughed, crossing their arms as they watched the race. Some even meandered after them. I watched from the edge still. I am not so easily assuaged as they were. Nevertheless, I didn't feel any need to stop them. They were welcome to their boorish game. I would watch and see exactly what would happen. Both had more sparks flash over them, neither thinking anything of it, before they were standing on the scorched flagstones. The younger sailor won handily. He thrusted his hand into the broken char, snatched up a golden necklace, and spun on his heel to taunt his comrade with it. The necklace had a pendant about as large as a young sailor's hand, with what looked like a ruby encrusted at its center. It flashed in the torchlight, but was strangely dark when the now frequent blue sparks flew. The amulet dangled from the chain until the young man whipped it into his own palm and brought it up to his face. My attention became transfixed on his expression. He had fine features and clever eyes. If he hadn't been made so gaunt by the hardships of a life at sea, he would have been exactly like many of my classmates. He was smiling, probably savoring the thrill of making a fool of his companion or thinking about what the amulet could mean to his meager life. Whatever the reason for it, that smile wavered when he looked into the gem. He became confused, stumbling on his feet, peering closer into the amulet. Another blue spark raced over him. He flinched but didn't look away from the ruby. There was suddenly a question he was trying to ask, to form with his mouth as his brow furrowed. He shuddered with another blue spark. This one seemed larger, and to linger, to dig deeper than just spidering along his skin. He choked, hunching his shoulders, holding the gem up to his face. I suppressed the urge to intervene, to somehow fix the problem. I didn't need to, as it turned out, since the bold sailor smashed his fist into the young man's face. The punch flung the young man to the ground, unconscious, I presume. The bold sailor didn't spare him a thought, merely ripping the amulet out of his limp fingers. He then turned the amulet this way and that appraisingly, like a store clerk or a consummate thief. Like the young man, the moment the bold sailor focused on the gem, he froze. He didn't have a smile that would falter. Rather, he had a judgmental scowl. This sailor had the demeanor of a commoner, one who resented his lot of life and had been made to suffer for it. Whatever he was going through, he was resisting it, clenching his jaw tightly enough to make the muscle along his jowl visibly twitch. A blue spark washed over him, and he shook violently with it. To my amazement, the bold sailor began to cry without making a sound. Tears began streaking down his face in moments, and yet he didn't move. The conniver and the other sailors crowded around him, oblivious to his plight, to look at the amulet as well. The young man was on the ground next to the road, forgotten, as 4 sailors stood shoulder to shoulder. They were all gazing into the ruby. None of them spoke. None of them moved. Even when the blue sparks leapt from one to another, almost playfully. One of them started to wail, and though he did so with the voice of a full-grown man, the noise he made, to my ear, was indistinguishable from the cries of my younger sister at the height of one of her fevers. The sailor had somehow become a distraught infant. Abruptly, they shuffled closer to one another, bathed in blue sparks now. At first, I thought that they were looking to comfort one another, seeking some sort of embrace to calm each other while their emotions ran rampant. Then I saw the young man being dragged along the ground by some unseen force, bringing him to the back of the angles of the other men. All of them pressed in closer, bending at odd angles, their limbs wrenching uncomfortably to wrap around the rest. The blue sparks' light became even more intense. The crackle they made gradually louder, sharper. None of them seemed to be aware of what was happening. They all cried desperately in their own way, but their wailing was constant, even when their bones began to snap. Their bodies pressed harder and harder against one another, with the invisible hands that were crushing them from either side, folding them into a ball. The young man's spine snapped in half as he was flattened against the legs of the rest. I could barely hear the noise of their bodies breaking over the crackle of the sparks and over their crying. It was still there, though, wet and painful, even as their bodies lost all semblance of the human form. They didn't stop crying, not for one moment, even when their lungs were pierced through by each other's ribs. They didn't stop until their heads were flattened, when the flashes of the blue sparks became a sphere of milky light. It was about 2 feet in diameter. Every bone, every muscle, and scrap of flesh of half a dozen full-grown men was inside of it, swirling beneath the glow. It hovered about 5 feet off the ground, with the amulet floating a few inches beneath it. This was the power and cruelty of Tecal made manifest. The sphere began to spin, compressing, shrinking, squeezing everything in it tighter and tighter. I knew what would happen next. The scorch marks on the flagstones, the ashes, the bare soil. It was all about to happen again. Even when that realization hit me, I couldn't look away, dumbstruck by being in the presence of something so powerful, so close to divine. I watched the sphere become a dot of solid light. I don't remember the explosion. The next thing I do remember is waking up on my side. 2 of my fingers on my left hand were gone, along with my left eye. Those wounds had been cauterized by the blast, but I felt mangled and torn across every inch of me. It was raining, and the water that dripped off of me mingled heavily with blood. I was certain I was going to die soon after. I made up my mind to answer one last question, experience one more thing in the world. I wanted to have my own taste of what the sailors went through. I picked myself off the ground, hobbled to where the ashes of the sailors were washing away. They wouldn't last as long as the debris of whatever burned first. I reached in for the amulet and pulled it out of the remains. It was warm. A blue spark flashed over me. I didn't look into the gem, head first into that fate. Instead, I turned it over. On the back there was an inscription, chiseled in meticulous, delicate style, that I had studied for hours while I was searching for this island. It read, "To my son, I've made this for you on the night before your birth. May you indulge in the sovereignty it grants you. Your father, Hagiano Pretense." The inscription offered no more. I was sure my time in this world was coming to an end, one way or another. These were my last few moments, the last answer that I would ever get. Even with that certainty, my fingers were trembling as I turned the amulet over in my hand and looked into the gem. I wiped away some of the ashes with my thumb. The facets of the gem were smooth and impossible. I felt another of the blue sparks race over me, over my burnt face. The pain was inconceivable. Mercifully, it only lasted for an instant. After it, I was somewhere else. I was in the wagon, stopped in the middle of the road, while the lava burst from the volcano shone in the distance. I was a child, born to wealth and power, who had never known hardship, and this was the moment my life ended at my father's hand. Anguish blossomed in me when I understood what my father was doing. I cried inconsolably. At that same moment, I was the slave who was born to serve, whipped to obey, and felt something other than fear for a single moment. It was anger, but not my own. It was the earth's. I felt that slave's relief as he realized he was dying. I was the slave taken from her family when she was a young woman. I was a slave that had been bought, sold, scarred, and beaten, but still of a hard heart. I was the slave that had once known joy, but no longer. I was a slave that had flung an axe that killed the horses. I was a slave that had reached for the door handle, roaring with anger. I was all of the rest, who saw the wagon, who saw the lava spill, and understood that the end of Tecal had come, and, for a brief moment, we were all free. I was the night bird who leapt into the air when the strange sound split the night, and yet was too slow to escape. I was every single one of its hatchlings as well, maddened with hunger and sudden distress. I was every worm, every insect, every soul that had been there. And there were so many. So many. I was the sailors. I was a conniver with the bitterness of a killer locked up behind a smile. I was the bold one facing every damned turn of fate with a hardened soul. I was the young man, seeking the briefest moment of joy in a world that would rather see me dead. I, for a moment, was every single one of them. Finally, I was the father who, blinded in a moment of anger, reached for the amulet, funneled its power into myself, and screamed into the night. I will not be humiliated like this. You curs will know my power. The world will tremble to the sound of my name, and your fate will be why. I was still him when he suddenly remembered his child was next to him. I was him turned to look down to that boy's face. Just as the spell took its terrible form and saw what was happening. His despair was mine, as well as his certainty that this was for the best. I knew that he was, in that last sliver of time he had left, trying to fool himself into believing just that. I know he failed. The amulet didn't take me. The rain had stopped by the time I came back to my senses. The burns on my face and my hand were dull, throbbing agony. It was a new day. I felt the sun. I don't know where the force of will came or why I chose to do so, but I picked myself up from the blood-smeared flagstone, put the amulet's chain around my neck, and wandered on. I've lost track of time since then. Knowing that the island is protected by the obsidian maw, I have no delusion of rescue, or that this journal will ever be found. If this journal is found, perhaps next to my bones, heed this warning. Beware of any power that indulges your pride, your anger, your greed. You are their pawn, not their master. Tecal still lives. There are still sparks of its power here, and they will lead you astray.
Written and performed by Cesar Gonzalez.